All right, so brothers, welcome to another presentation of the North Carolina Masonic Research Society. Tonight we're thrilled to have Worshipful Brother Brent Kaleta. Brent is past master of Zetland Lodge number 83 in beautiful Calgary, Alberta, and a current member by affiliation with State College Lodge number 770 here in Raleigh, North Carolina. And Brent has some unique perspectives based on his experiences, culturally, religiously, uh, perspectives that a lot of us don't often take into account. And so when he talks about the many sides of King Solomon, he's really approaching it or demonstrating that from the perspective of these various
I have to eat too.
religions and cultures. And I'm sorry, Brent, before we get started, I'm going to mute everyone because we have some talkative folks. Okay, there we go. But Brent, I'm going to make you co-host so that you can share your screen, and whenever you're ready, you can get started. Let's make co-host. There you go. So Brent, it's all yours.
All right, let me just start off by going into screen share. Okay, so you're seeing my screen now, right, Matt?
Looks good.
Okay, so I'm in a hotel right now sucking up a lot of bandwidth, so I'll do my best to make sure that when I glitch and freeze that I stop so you guys don't lose too much. Okay, hopefully I can do that. So to begin with, let me say how wonderful it is to be here. It's been an honor to be allowed to participate as a presenter. Thank you so much for the invitation. So just a couple things before we even get started. First off, I am not a subject matter expert on any of the content of this presentation. It started out as a personal interest and evolved into a presentation from there. Second off, this presentation will touch on the subject of religion, but one, we're not in a tiled lodge, and even if we were, it's not about my religion being better than yours. It's about the same story about King Solomon, just presented from different points of view. A lot of the references to Solomon from the Masonic point of view that I will use are taken from what is referred to as the Canadian Rite Ritual, as that is the ritual of my mother lodge. Canadian Rite Ritual is similar to an emulation ritual to what you would see in England or Scotland. It is very different from the majority of ritual in the US, so you'll actually be seeing a different form of Masonry presented here. I'm always on the lookout for feedback. So if something's incorrect in my presentation or can be improved on, somebody please whisper wise counsel and let me know. And I will always say this, at the start of the presentation, it may seem like I'm wandering around and that I'm lost, but it all comes together by the end. So with those disclaimers in place, let's get started. So what is Freemasonry? We all have no doubt been asked that question before, perhaps by a friend, family member, coworker, or a curious person who saw our ring. How do we usually answer? The world's oldest fraternity? Perhaps we say that it's an organization that makes good men better. Maybe we jokingly say that it's a not-so-secret secret society. One of the most intriguing aspects of our noble craft is that its origins are a mystery, and those origins have been lost to the mists of time. Yes, we know certain facts, like the meeting of 4 lodges at the Goose and Gridiron in 1717, but there is much speculation, and that makes it difficult to find our exact start. Every man who has been made a Mason has heard these lines spoken by the junior warden before, telling us that the usages and customs of ancient Freemasonry have ever corresponded to those of the Egyptian philosophers, to whom they bear a near affinity, and how those philosophers concealed their tenets and principles within hieroglyphical figures, and they were communicated by signs and symbols. With that being said, our ancient craft bears an even closer affinity to something else. What I really want to focus on in this presentation is the question that is asked of our initiates as part of their examinations, where they are asked, "What is Freemasonry?" And they reply, "A beautiful system of morality veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols." Veiled in allegory is where this exploration tonight actually begins. So, what is an allegory? It is described as a poem, story, picture, or something that can be interpreted to reveal the hidden meaning, typically a moral or political one. Synonyms include parable, analogy, metaphor, symbol, emblem, story, myth, saga, or fable. Some of the more famous allegories that we are familiar with are books like Animal Farm, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Lord of the Flies, and The Pilgrim's Progress. However, for us as Masons, that beautiful system of morality as veiled in allegory and taught by symbolism that we want to explore in our studies is that building of the wonderful edifice, King Solomon's Temple, of which King Solomon was one of the three Grand Masters involved in its construction. And that is where we will focus tonight. Do a Google search or do a search the old-fashioned way in pretty much any Masonic book written, and you will find references to our Grand Master, King Solomon, and the temple he helped to construct. However, for the purposes of this discussion on King Solomon in Masonry, I'm really going to try and stick to what is talked about within ritual. Within our story, we are taught through our degrees that our allegory ties us to the building of the Temple at Jerusalem, which is used as a symbol to represent how we as Masons are instructed to build ourselves into a better man that we should always strive to be. We are introduced to three Grand Masters: Solomon, King of Israel, Hiram, King of Tyre, and Hiram Abiff. And we know from our journey, Hiram Abiff is the key figure in our story, with King Solomon playing a secondary role. Much of what we learn about King Solomon is presented as part of our Junior Warden's lecture. We are told that King Solomon made many great thanksgivings, burnt sacrifices, and costly offerings at the building, completion, and dedication of the temple at Jerusalem to God's service. We are told that our lodges are supported by three great pillars associated with wisdom, strength, and beauty, and that King Solomon is associated with wisdom. The wisdom to not only contrive the temple, but to build it and dedicate it. It is also at this point that we learned that each of the Grand Masters are represented in architecture, and the three most celebrated forms, Ionic, Doric, and Corinthian, are used. These correspond to Solomon, King of Israel, Hiram, King of Tyre, and Hiram Abiff, and Ionic and King Solomon are associated together. For a brief moment here, we're going to take a side trip and specifically talk about Solomon's Temple as presented in the ancient York Rite ritual, or a lot of the ritual that we see within the United States. And it's something I want you to file for later because it becomes an important part of our discussion. We are told that at the building of King Solomon's Temple, there was not heard the sound of an axe, hammer, or any metal tool. The stones were hewn, squared, and numbered in the quarries where they were made. The timbers were felled and prepared in the forests of Lebanon and then conveyed by sea on floats to Joppa and thence over land to Jerusalem, where they were set by the aid of wooden instruments prepared for that purpose. And when the building was completed, that every part fitted together with such exact nicety that it resembled more the work of the supreme architect of the universe than that of human hands. As I said, file that point for later. We're going to make some connections to it. We go on to learn that our ancient brethren dedicated their lodges to King Solomon, and that he was said to have been our first, most excellent Grand Master. As we proceed through the degrees, we start to see Solomon's wisdom is established in a test word to determine who is friend or foe, and that this becomes the password for the fellowcraft degree. to prevent unqualified people from ascending the winding staircase which leads to the middle chamber of the temple. We start to see the connection with specific numbers and their importance. 3 to rule a lodge, as there were 3 grand masters who bore sway at the building of the temple, King Solomon being one of those 3. 7, as King Solomon was 7 years and upward in building, completing, and dedicating the temple. As we approach the last of the degrees, we learn that Solomon was active in the building of the temple as one of the 3 grand masters. When Hiram Abiff was missing and confusion was the order of the day, the overseers alerted King Solomon, and he organized a general muster of all the ranks. Once aware of the situation, he organized the search parties and set them to work. When informed of the death of Grand Master Hiram Abiff, we are told that King Solomon was grief-stricken. When the murderous parties were caught, he executed them with extreme prejudice. We are told that he journeyed into the desert, and that it was ultimately he who raised the body of the Grand Master Hiram Abiff, using a specific grip, and then designated the substitute signs and tokens and words for Master Masons to use until such time and circumstances would allow for the restoration of the genuine ones. Within our lodges, we know that the worshipful master of the lodge is symbolically installed on the chair of King Solomon, and that the worshipful master humbly serves the lodge as the representative of King Solomon. But what about King Solomon in history? So moving on to a different side of King Solomon, what does history have to say about our Grand Master? Well, Solomon in history is a little bit of a mystery, and scholars are divided on the subject. Historical evidence of King Solomon, other than the volumes of the sacred law, has been so minimal that some scholars have referred to the period of his reign as a dark age. The 1st century Roman Jewish scholar Josephus, in Against Apion, cited a Tyrian court document which did give a specific year during which King Hiram of Tyre sent materials to Solomon for the construction of the temple. However, no material evidence has been presented that conclusively proves that Solomon's reign could actually have been founded. Archaeology, including excavations at places such as Hazor, Megiddo, Bet Shahan, and Gezer, uncovered structures that have some arguable date to Solomon's reign, but others argue that they could date to the Omrid period, which was more than a century after Solomon's supposed reign. According to Finkelstein and Silberman, authors of the Bible Unearthed, archaeology's new version of ancient Israel and the origin of its sacred texts, at the time of the kingdoms of David and Solomon, Jerusalem was populated by only a few hundred residents or less, which is insufficient to be an empire stretching from the Euphrates to Elath. According to the same book, archaeological evidence suggests that the kingdom of Israel at the time of Solomon was little more than a small city-state. Although both Finkelstein and Silberman accept that David and Solomon were real inhabitants of Judah in about the 10th century BCE, they claim that the earliest independent references to the kingdom of Israel is about 890 BCE, and for Judah about 750 BCE. Some scholars suggest that because of religious prejudice, the authors of the Bible suppressed the achievements of the Omrids, whom the Hebrew Bible described as being polytheists, and instead pushed them back to the supposed golden age of Judaism and monotheism and the devotees of Yahweh. There are several scholars who are critical of these opinions and instead present that the principal points of the biblical tradition of Solomon are generally trustworthy, with the exception that to date, no substantial archaeological evidence has been found that supports the Queen of Sheba's visit to Solomon. Many scholars argue that Solomon ruled over a comparatively wealthy mini-empire rather than a small city-state, and that the temple, as described in the volume of Sacred Law, would have been reasonable and a typically sized structure of the region for the time, and that there is direct Bronze and Iron Age parallels for every feature of Solomon's temple as described within archaeology. Some scholars have charted a middle path between those who believe that Solomon is a totally invented character on the one hand, and those who believe that there is evidence to support his existence to varying degrees. For example, archaeologists have argued that the biblical description of Solomon date to a later period of history, and that it is likely that his wealth, building, and kingdoms have been overstated. They do feel that Solomon did have an acropolis and ruled over an area larger than Jerusalem. Scholars also believe that there must have been a ruler in Jerusalem during this period and that he likely built the temple, although the town was quite small. The archaeological remains considered to date from the period of time of Solomon are notable for the fact that Canaanite material appears to have been continued unabated, considering that they were an undefeated people. From an archaeological perspective, there was a lack of physical evidence to show the existence of Solomon or his temple. With that said, there's also this is not unexpected because the area was devastated by the Babylonians, then rebuilt and destroyed several more times during history. Additionally, little excavation has occurred in the area of the Temple Mount, which is the foundation of Solomon's temple as it is to be considered holy ground. Of interest, it should be noted that the Bible points to a place called Tarshish as a source of King Solomon's great wealth in metals, especially silver, but also gold, tin, and iron. And there have been links established to archaeological evidence of silver hoards found in Phoenicia in 2013 that have originated from that location. The metals from Tarshish were reportedly obtained by Solomon in partnership with King Hiram of Tyre and the fleets of Tarshish ships that sailed in their service. And the silver hoard provides the first potentially recognizable material evidence that suggests that the ancient texts concerning Solomon's temple and his wealth are accurate. We first hear of Solomon as being born to David and his wife Bathsheba in Jerusalem. At the death of their son, that was conceived through adultery. Solomon's name comes from the Hebrew word Shilomin, which means peace. As a boy, Solomon was entrusted by David to his prophet Nathan to train him. Nathan called him by the name Jedediah, which means friend of God. Solomon was not the firstborn son, so he would not have been first in line to become heir to his father David's throne. However, David decided, based on God's instruction, early on that Solomon would sit on his throne instead of his elder son. Solomon assumed the throne while David was still alive. However, this did not prevent David's older son, Adonijah, from trying to forcibly take the throne. Within the Bible, Solomon is known for his wisdom. Not long after Solomon became king, God visited him in a dream and told Solomon to ask him for whatever he wanted, and he would give it to him. Solomon replied that he was but as a child and did not know how to proceed as the king of God's people. He then asked that God give him an understanding heart to judge God's people so that he could discern between good and bad. God was pleased with Solomon's request. He said that because Solomon had not asked for a long life, riches, nor the lives of his enemies, but instead understanding to discern judgment, that he would give Solomon a wise and understanding heart. God added that there would be no one like him then or after him. God said that he would also give Solomon great riches and honor. God concluded by saying that if Solomon walked in God's way, that he would give him a long life. Solomon woke from this dream and immediately went to Jerusalem and stood before the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord and made offerings and a feast for his servants. Solomon's father David desired to build a permanent temple for God while he was still on the throne. However, God told David that because he had shed blood, he would not be allowed to build it. Instead, God told him that he had chosen for his son Solomon to build it. David gave instructions to Solomon about how God wanted the temple built and provided everything that Solomon needed. The temple was started within the 4th year of Solomon's reign and completed 7 years later. The Bible tells us that Solomon also built houses for himself. One was a personal house, and the second was built as a house that he would use to judge court cases. This courthouse is where Solomon heard and decided cases. It was quite lavish and built from the finest materials. He also built a house for his Egyptian wife, whom he married to make peace with Pharaoh. Solomon accumulated and spent great amounts of money on a lavish lifestyle like no other person in history. As we learned, Solomon had an Egyptian wife. He went on to marry 700 wives and had 300 concubines or mistresses. Many of these women worshiped false gods. This led Solomon to also worship false gods, which had a negative impact on his life. We can see from Solomon's weakness and desire for adulterous relationships that eventually caused the loss of many blessings from God. Because of Solomon's polygamy and lavish lifestyle, his time became more consumed with worldly and adulterous pursuits. This led to Solomon ignoring the Lord's directives, which angered God. Therefore, God raised up enemies to attack and take away a large part of the kingdom from Solomon. God explained that he allowed this to happen because of Solomon's worshiping other gods and not walking in God's way. God did not forsake Solomon, but Solomon's actions greatly influenced the kingdom in a negative way. It is sad that Solomon had all the wisdom in the world provided to him, yet he also made choices that were unwise. Solomon is responsible for writing a great amount of scripture. He wrote Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, and the Song of Solomon. The Song of Solomon was part of more than 1,000 songs that he wrote. Looking at Solomon within Judaism, King Solomon is referred to as Shiloh Hamlech and is recognized as the 3rd king of Israel. It is accepted that he was born in Jerusalem, that he was the 2nd child born to David and Bathsheba after their first child died as a baby. He was named Solomon, which means peace, since peace would reign in his day. He was named by his mother, but the prophet Nathan referred to him as Jedediah, meaning beloved of God. Solomon's battle for the crown began even prior to his father David's passing. David had promised Solomon's mother Bathsheba that Solomon would be the loyal heir after he passed away. However, as David became old and frail, another son, Adonijah, conspired to claim the throne. Although Adonijah had openly rebelled against him, Solomon pardoned him for that. Familial peace was restored until Adonijah again tried to make a move for the crown by attempting to marry David's widow, Abishag. For that, the newly crowned Solomon had him killed in a decisive early move to mark his kingship. Since he was only 12 years old when he ascended to the throne, Solomon was understandably worried about his ability to rule effectively. He decided to ask God for help. He traveled to Gibeon and offered up sacrifices. God appeared to him and asked what he wanted. King Solomon requested that he be granted the wisdom to rule effectively. God was very pleased that Solomon had asked for wisdom, as opposed to wealth or the like. God granted that request. He became famous for his wisdom and knowledge. With his legendary wisdom, Solomon had control over demons and could speak the languages of animals. He was a masterful songwriter and a composer of parables and proverbs. He was also an expert in botany and zoology. His renown spread the world over. God also blessed him with wealth that he had not requested, along with a long life. Solomon's reign was a golden age for the nation of Israel. They were respected by their neighbors, resided in peace for the entirety of Solomon's kingdom, and it was also a good time economically, with many nations bringing Solomon tribute and commerce. Solomon married the daughter of Pharaoh in Egypt to cement his rule. He continued making treaties with all the other countries around him, ensuring that his rule would be marked by peace, not war. Once Solomon felt that his kingship was firmly established, he set out to complete the project that his father David had begun, the building of the Holy Temple, a home for God. The first step he took was enlisting Hiram, the king of Tyre, who had been a friend of his father, King David. Hiram had access to the cedars that Solomon needed. Solomon hired him to cut the cedars and send them to him so that he could use them to build the temple. Hiram was very pleased with the offer and agreed to it. Once the cedars were taken care of, the stone needed to be quarried. For that, Solomon conscripted men from his own nation. He sent thousands of men into the quarries in the north of Israel, along with many more thousands of porters to transport the stones back to Jerusalem. In the 4th year of Solomon's reign, construction on the temple began. Finished stones and beams were imported, so that no axe or other metal instrument were wielded on the Temple Mount. The temple, a building of peace, could not have implements of war used on the site to build it. Construction of the temple took 7 years. Once completed, it was a magnificent structure and was renowned the world over. The first step after the temple was completed was to bring the ark from where it was resting in the city of David to the temple. They brought the ark into the Holy of Holies and placed it underneath the cherubim's wings. Once they did that, the room filled with a cloud. The Spirit of God had come to rest. After that, he slaughtered a lot of sheep and oxen. A lot of sheep and oxen, as in 21,000 oxen and 120,000 sheep. Everyone ate very well that night. The Queen of Sheba heard of the greatness and the wisdom of Solomon. The stories that she heard intrigued her enough that she came personally to visit. She brought camels and caravans full of spice and gold, along with many precious stones as gifts. She was also accompanied by a huge number of servants. On top of that, she brought riddles and questions to determine the extent of Solomon's wisdom and to see if the rumors about him were true. Solomon exceeded expectations. Every riddle or question she posed was thoroughly solved or answered. She was very impressed with the order and prompt display in Solomon's court, along with the volume and the nutrition of the food served. Solomon hosted her well, giving her everything she asked for. Satisfied with her visit, the Queen of Sheba complimented King Solomon, blessed God who had appointed King Solomon, and gave him 120 talents of silver. With that, she returned to her country. King Solomon, as we mentioned, ruled in a grandiose style and did not do small. This was especially true in the case of his wives. In addition to the daughter of Pharaoh, he married many women from the Moabite, Amorite, Edomite, Zidionite, and Hittite nations. He had 700 royal wives and 300 concubines. Although his marriage to these women did cement certain political relationships, they eventually led to his downfall. As he got older, his wives began to turn his heart away from God. Although he did not personally indulge in idol worship, he was tolerant of its practice in a way that King David never would have been. This angered God greatly. He had shown Solomon godly revelations twice, and it still had not been enough to ensure that Solomon would stay on the straight and narrow, the path of godly worship. The punishment for this was that the kingship of Solomon would be torn under the reign of his son Rehoboam. After 40 years of rule, Solomon passed away and was buried with his father in the city of David. His son Rehoboam ruled in his stead. Many of the tribes refused to accept Rehoboam as king, resulting in the land of Israel splitting into two distinct kingdoms, with the kingdom of Judah in the south and the kingdom of Israel in the north. This divide would last until the destruction of the temple hundreds of years later. In Islamic tradition, all prophets are recognized by the phrase, "Peace be upon him," following their name. For efficiency, please assume that this has been said every time I say Solomon and David's name. In Islam, Suleiman or Solomon is venerated as a prophet and a messenger of God, as well as a divinely appointed monarch who ruled over the kingdom of Israel. As in Judaism and Christianity, Islam recognizes Solomon as the son of the prophet Dawood or King David and Saba or Bathsheba. He was born in Jerusalem. As he was a talented man with versatile gifts, his father made him his heir. After the death of David, he ascended to the throne of Judah because of his power of judgment, right understanding, and spiritual insight. The Quran ascribes to Solomon a great level of wisdom, knowledge, and power. He knew the language of the birds. Solomon was also known in Islam to have other supernatural abilities bestowed upon him by Allah, after a special request by Solomon himself, such as controlling the wind, ruling over the jinn, which are a genie or a spirit creature, enslaving demons, and hearing the communication of In both Judaism and Islam, Solomon was able to control spirit beings. He was also given the power over the jinn and the devil. He utilized them in his service. They carried out his orders ungrudgingly and were punished when they became disobedient. The Quran states that they worked for him as he desired, making arches, images, basins as large as reservoirs, and cooking cauldrons. In other verses of the Quran, it says, before Suleiman were marshaled his hosts of jinn and men and birds, and they were all in order and rank. Similarly, the queen of Saba or Sheba plays a significant role in the story of Solomon. The area which now composes Yemen is also known as Saba and was ruled by a queen. It was a prosperous kingdom. The queen enabled its people to attain a high degree of civilization. One day, Hud, a little bird, returned from his travels and informed the prophet Suleiman of the flourishing kingdom of Saba. He said, "The ruler of Saba is a queen upon whom God has bestowed his unlimited favor. Her throne is magnificent, but she is depraved. The inhabitants of her kingdoms worship the sun and the moon. They do not worship Allah and refrain from thanking him who has created all these objects." Suleiman, the prophet of Allah, and the king wrote a letter and handed it over to Hud to be conveyed to the queen of Sheba. He warned her, "Do not be arrogant of your power." He advised her to submit to God and abide by his commandments. The queen read this letter and was very puzzled. As she was a prudent lady, she called her chiefs and sought their counsel. Some proud chiefs suggested that they fight tooth and nail against Solomon, whereas others left the matter for her to decide. The queen did not want to embroil her country in a war because it would cause destruction. So she thought of a plan and arranged for precious gifts for Solomon and intended to develop cordial relations and pacify her warlike subjects by using this means. Wealth had no value to Solomon, and he was annoyed at the delivery of the presents. He returned them with harsh words and said to the messenger, "I do not hanker after wealth. I therefore attach no importance to these costly gifts. I wish that the queen and her followers should submit to God. I shall invade your country if the queen does not come to me in submission." After some time, the king marched with his army and passed through the valley of his ants on his way to the kingdom of Saba. In the valley, he overheard the conversation among the terrified ants, who hurried towards their hole for fear of being crushed under the foot of the marching army. The king was moved with pity and learnt the lesson to protect the life and honor of humble creatures. He thought that the queen and her people are just like humble ants. They should not be trampled upon and killed to win fame in the world. Solomon did not proceed further because he did not like the massacre which would result of a clash between the armies. When the queen got wind of the expected attack of Solomon, she proceeded towards him to patch up differences. When the king came to know of her departure, he ordered a jinn to bring her magnificent throne to him. The command was immediately obeyed. When the queen arrived at the court of Solomon after a long journey, she was asked to identify her throne. She recognized her throne and said, "I am aware of your power and majesty. I have come to you as your submissive servant." The queen was taken to a lofty palace. The floor was made of slabs of polished glass that deceived the eyes and looked like water. The queen tucked up her skirt to pass through it. She was surprised that it was not water. Then she realized that reality did not lay at the surface and it needed to be seen in depth. Solomon ruled for 30 years. He died at the age of 89 years, and at his death, Rehoboam, his son, became king. He led a luxurious life and yielded to pleasure, seeking temptations. The people revolted against him, and soon the glorious chapter of the reign of David's family came to an end. One of the significant differences between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam is that Islam refutes the claim that Solomon turned to idolatry. Instead, it was believed that one of the enslaved jinn or genie that Solomon controlled escaped his enslavement and took over the kingdom and posed as Solomon. Therefore, Solomon had actually remained faithful to God the whole time. So now let's go down the rabbit hole and see where it ends up. In the Baha'i faith, Solomon is regarded as one of the lesser prophets, along with David, Israel, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and others. The Baha'i see Solomon as a prophet who was sent by God to address the issues of his time, and he is depicted as a contemporary of Pythagoras. A well-known story in the collection of 1001 Nights describes a genie who had displeased King Solomon and was punished by being locked in a bottle and thrown in the sea. Since the bottle was sealed with Solomon's seal, the genie was helpless to free himself until freed many centuries later by a fisherman who discovered the bottle. In other stories from 1001 Nights, protagonists who have had to leave their homeland and travel to unknown places of the world saw signs which proved that Solomon had already been there. Sometimes the protagonist discovers words of Solomon like abracadabra or open sesame that were intended to help those who were lost and had unluckily reached those forbidden and deserted places. A magic ring called the Seal of Solomon was supposedly given to him and gave him power over the demons or jinn. The magical symbol said to have been on the Seal of Solomon, which made it effective, is often considered to be the Star of David, though this emblem, also known as the Shield of David, is known to have been associated with Judaism only as recently as the 11th century CE, while the five-pointed star or the pentagram can be found on jars and other artifacts from Jerusalem dating back at least to the 2nd and 4th centuries BCE, and is more likely to have been the emblem found on the ring, reportedly used by King Solomon to control the jinn or demons. Asmodeus, king of the demons, was one day captured using this ring and forced to remain in Solomon's service. The Seal of Solomon, in some legends, is known as the Ring of Analab and was highly sought after as a symbol of power. In several legends, different groups or individuals attempt to steal it or to obtain it in some manner. One legend concerning Solomon involves Asmodeus, the king of the demon. It goes on to state that Solomon one day asked Asmodeus what can make demons powerful over man. And Asmodeus asked to be freed and given the ring so that he could demonstrate. Solomon agreed, but Asmodeus threw the ring into the sea, and it was swallowed by a fish. Asmodeus then swallowed the king, stood up fully with one wing touching heaven and the other one touching earth, and spat out Solomon for a distance of 400 miles. This was explained as divine punishment for Solomon having failed to follow 3 divine commands, and Solomon was forced to wander from city to city until he eventually arrived at an Ammonite city where he was forced to work in the king's kitchen. Solomon gained a chance to prepare a meal for the Ammonite king, which the king found so impressive that the previous cook was sacked and Solomon was put in his place. The king's daughter, Naaman, subsequently fell in love with Solomon, but the family, thinking that Solomon was a commoner, disapproved. So the king decided to kill them both by sending them into the desert. Solomon and the king's daughter wandered the desert until they reached a coastal city, where they bought a fish to eat, which happened to be the one that had swallowed the magic ring. Solomon was then able to regain his throne and expel Asmodeus. The element of a ring thrown into the sea and being found again in a fish's belly also appeared in Herodotus' account of Polycrates, the tyrant of Samos. In another similar version of the legend of the Seal of Solomon, Asmodeus disguises himself. In some myths, he disguises himself as King Solomon, while in more frequently versions, he is disguised as a falcon, calling himself Gavin, one of King Solomon's trusted friends. The concealed Asmodeus tells travelers who have ventured up to King Solomon's grand and lofty palace that the Seal of Solomon was thrown into the sea. He then convinces them to plunge in and attempt to retrieve it, for if they do, they would take the throne as king. Other magical items attributed to Solomon are his key and his table. The latter was said to have been held in Toledo, Spain, during Visigoth rule, and was part of the loot taken by Tariq ibn Ziyad during the Umayyad conquest of Iberia, according to Ibn Abdel Ilhamak, History of the Conquest of Spain. The former appears in the title of a Lesser Key of Solomon, a grimoire, whose framing of the story of Solomon is captured with him using his ring to control demons and forcing them to explain things to him. In the Book of Deadly Names, purportedly translated from an Arabic manuscript found hidden in a building in Spain, the king of the jinn, Fiqtush, brings 72 jinn before King Solomon to confess their corruptions and places of residence. Fiqtush tells King Solomon the recipes for curing such corruptions as each jinn confesses. Angels, much like jinn and demon, are also told to help Solomon in the building a temple, though not by choice. The edifice was, according to rabbinical legend, miraculously constructed throughout, and the large heavy stones raised and set in their respective places by themselves. The general opinion of the rabbis is that Solomon hewed the stones by means of a shamir, a mythical worm whose mere touch cleft rocks. According to Midrash Tehillim, the Shemir was brought from paradise by Solomon's eagle. But most of the rabbis state that Solomon was informed of the worm's haunts by Asmodeus. The Shamar has been entrusted by the Prince of the Sea to the mountain rooster alone, and the rooster was sworn to guard it well. But Solomon's men found the bird's nest, covered it in glass. When the bird returned, it used the Shamar to break the glass, whereas the men scared the bird, causing it to abandon the worm, which the men took to Solomon. Early adherents of the Cabal portray Solomon as having sailed through the air on a throne of light placed on an eagle, which brought him near the heavenly gate as well as to the dark mountain behind which the fallen angels Uzzah and Azazel were chained. The eagle would rest on the chains, and Solomon, using his magic ring, would compel the two angels to reveal every mystery that he desired to know. So in conclusion, what do we learn from this? To be honest, I really don't know. But we can certainly say, what is Freemasonry? A beautiful system of morality veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols that can be interpreted many, many, many different ways based on our personal beliefs, our journey, and our growth. But if we take those and we share them, we may be able to help another person with their journey, which is what we really want to do with this. So in conclusion, thank you for listening to me this evening.
Brent, that was absolutely fantastic. I enjoyed that. Learned a lot more about different aspects of Solomon than what I was aware of just from the Judeo-Christian standpoint. So, brothers, if anybody has any questions for Brent, feel free to unmute yourself and ask. Okay. And if any brothers watching on Facebook on Refracted Light, if you have any questions, feel free to post them into the comments, and I'll be happy to ask for you.
Hey, Brent, excellent presentation.
Thank you.
I had a question. You actually said this during the presentation, but I couldn't hear. When you were discussing the rings and the Seal of Solomon, which design were you saying was the likely to be the most accurate one?
So that's actually one of those things where, I mean, the first question is, did the ring even exist, right? Because it is really kind of a mythical creation. And then some scholars would say that, well, you would have, the Star of David or the Shield of David, which is what we associate with Judaism on there, as being the most likely piece. But historically, that really didn't come in until 11 CE. So it'd be not commonly associated with Solomon's period. Whereas if you take, let's say, the mark of the pentagram or the five-pointed star, evidence of that has been found back as far as 4 BCE. So it's kind of one of those things that what was on there, no one really knows. But if you're looking at it from which came first, the pentagram existed first. So that would be a more likely assumption as to what would have been on the ring.
Okay. Thanks.
And let's see. Joe Martinez has asked if I can ask Worshipful Brother Brent about the authorship of Ecclesiastes and Songs of Solomon and their attribution to Solomon. The earliest written copies, extant are post-CE, but most historians attribute these books to post-Second Temple writing. So he wanted to get your thoughts on those writings.
Okay. So first of all, Brother Martinez, thank you for that. And when I did this presentation, what I really tried to do was to take as much of a neutral approach as I could, specifically because I was touching on the three Abrahamic faiths. So what I did in the process of looking for research was what was kind of the most common points of reference. So it's kind of like what occurred more often than not. So it's kind of one of those things that throughout what I was looking at, you know, Ecclesiastes, Songs of Solomon, those are the ones that they say are attributed to Solomon. Yes, I completely agree that there is a lot of stuff out there that says it was probably written much later, but in one of those things that I guess I'll use the term in respect for the majority of Christianity's beliefs, I left it as that those would have been attributed to him. So I know I'm not directly answering your question about it, but I kind of wanted to play as neutral as I could while talking about the subject of religion.
So, Brent, that brings up something interesting. From the Christian perspective, they refer to the Bible as being written in the original Greek. And that's because a lot of these stories were just oral traditions until the founding of the city of Alexandria, and the Greeks, being scholars, gathered all of this knowledge and actually reduced it to writing many times for the first time ever. And so I'm wondering if that may be the reason why some of our stories of Solomon, or written history, may be attributed to the CE era, as opposed to its contemporary time when it supposedly was formed.
You know what, I have to agree with that, but I also have to look at it this way and go, you know, the Bible as is accepted by the Christian world today, as we know, was largely decided on by the Council of Nicaea based on what they felt the Bible was going to be. And I honestly think that that probably played a bigger influence on the writing of the Bible than anything else, because the fact that they selected 66 books that are in there now that comprise the modern Bible versus stuff that we see that's accepted from an academic or scholarly purpose really raises the question that even though it is said that the Bible is God's word and has not been altered, were things placed in a different order, a different timeline, were things slightly altered to make a more contemporary flow, right? But I guess this is the whole thing, that when we look at any volume of sacred law and its origins, it really does become a matter of the faith of the person who is believing it and the faith of the person who wants to accept it.
Well said. Hey, do we have any other questions for?
I would have a question. You mentioned that Solomon wished, when God asked him what he wanted, he wished for a wise and understanding heart. Does Solomon have an influence in modern day law? Is any of his practices and decisions, are they taught to law students today?
That's a really good question, Yves. And I guess the answer to that is, having never sat in a law class, I don't directly know, right? But what we do know is this: depending on where you are in the world, the sacred texts have played an influence on how laws are written. So, for example, if you are in the United States or Canada, which are largely a Judeo-Christian background, pieces of the Bible and pieces of the Torah show up within what we see as the law. If you live in an Islamic country, pieces of the law show up there, especially within like Sharia law. If you live in other parts of the world, you see that background plays a piece on it. So when we look at the way that Solomon dealt with things from an attribute of being just and fair and how he settled property disputes and stuff like that, we could say that, yeah, a lot of our modern law is attached to the division of, fair recompense for wrong that's been done, right? So indirectly, I'd say you could say that he probably did influence modern law, but the only real direct tie would be tying back to a book of faith that's had an influence in a country. But would like to think that, he did establish a courthouse to dispense judgment in, and that is something that's probably influenced down to this day.
As someone who actually works in the legal profession, I'm not an attorney, by the way, but has spent, well over a decade in the court system and judicial branch. A lot of it is very reminiscent of Solomon. There's a lot that's not and really could be improved upon, but it's hard to imagine that we started out with 10 rules on a stone tablet, and now it's evolved into this.
I blame it on traffic law.
Okay. Well, Brent, thank you again. That was fantastic, and we'll give one more opportunity. Anyone with any questions? There, Tim, go ahead.
Hey, Brent, which when you were doing your research, which parts were absolutely most interesting that you could have gone down the rabbit hole a little further in?
Oh, you faded out a little bit there, Tim, but I caught the part about the rabbit hole. So where this really started was primarily in exploration through the three Abrahamic faiths as to how Solomon is viewed, simply because the one thing that I found from research across all three is that I'll put it this way, there's more in common than what's not in common between the three Abrahamic religions. So you do see the ties with it. It kind of like how it would be almost like a family story. Okay, this is what Uncle Bob did, but each cousin tells it a little bit different. And it was just kind of one of those things that as I did that exploration, 2 out of the 3 religions talk about Solomon being able to control spirit beings. So, it says that he was able to control demons, he was able to control the angels, and he was able to control jinn. So because those 2 faiths had that tie to it, that's where I kind of started looking at, okay, let's see what's out there that's related to Solomon that may not have ever been part of kind of something that a person would learn in a mainstream religion. So a lot of that just came out of, looking at some different myths and legends. Sometimes something would pop up in reference on a TV show that prompted me to go kind of look and go, okay, was this just something that showed up on Supernatural because the writers liked it, or did they actually pull it from something that existed, right? And it was kind of, I included it as part of this because it's one of those things that when we look at some of the stuff in the rabbit hole, it does support stuff within the 3 Abrahamic religions, especially as it related to his ability to interact with the supernatural world. And that's kind of why I included it, just because I wanted to see people's reaction. Every once in a while, you got to go down a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
And speaking of rabbit holes, Brother Jeremy Chevier asked over on Facebook, when you were doing this research, what was the deepest thing that you learned?
Oh, okay. So, for me personally, to answer that, the deepest thing was actually looking at how within the 3 Abrahamic religions, how much exactly there was that we would see that was shared. You know what I mean? And I think that's important because a lot of times we see religion as a divisive factor, especially when we talk about Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, right? If you want to divide a room of people, start talking about that and see exactly where it falls. But the reality was for me that there's more shared and there's more that reinforces and there's more reason why it should be supportive than it should be adversive. So I'll say that was the deepest personal reflection for me. If we're talking about going down the rabbit hole, some of the stuff about Azrael was pretty cool. Just when you start talking about, a demon who is able to touch one wing to heaven and touch one wing to earth at the same time, who is yet still under Solomon's control. Like, how big was this guy and what could he do?
So Following up on that question, Brother Tim Dahlman. Tim, I'll let you ask. Go right ahead.
Was there anything you learned that, man, this is really cool, but I don't feel right about including it in this presentation?
I'll throw it out there. Come on, Tim.
Like you're like, man, this is cool, but I just can't get myself to do this. To this part.
I guess the answer to that is no, and I'll explain why. I mean, it's very clear in Masonry that we don't discuss religion in lodge because it's divisive. Now, I will 100% say my personal interpretation of always that has been, we don't discuss my religion versus your religion and why my religion is right and yours is wrong, right? I think that as a Mason, the more that we understand other people and the more that we understand other people's faith, the more that it can either reinforce our own, or the more it at least allows us to understand how they think as a person, right? So when I went into this presentation, especially since the first time that I did this presentation, it was for a workshop that is exactly that. It's an academic workshop. I kind of went, if I can, kind of find it, reference it, and make it fit, it was going in there, right? And that's kind of, I guess every time I do this presentation, I kind of roll the dice a little bit, which is why there's the disclaimer at the front. It's not an entire lodge, and this is not about mine's right and yours is wrong, because you'll notice that throughout all three of them, I tried to emphasize the same points. Start off with the same thing: who his parents were, who his parents were, who his parents were, how he came to power, how he came to power, how he came to power, what he asked of God, what he asked of God, what he asked of God, what went good and what went wrong. So I tried to keep it consistent with that, so that I basically tried not to offend anybody while making them think.
So, Brent, I'd like to go back and touch on the building of the temple through the Islamic mythos or culture. When we talk about Solomon actually controlling the jinn to assist in building the temple, can you elaborate more on that story? Because you and I have discussed this before. I think it's fascinating.
Yeah, so I guess the thing to keep in mind is that it shows both in Islam and it shows in Judaism, because there's a reference to the rabbis that in the rabbinical text, it says that the angels participated, though unwillingly, and that, the temple had a heavenly adornment to it because of their touch, right? So when you look at it this way, because of being able to control a spirit being, in Judaism, it was demons or angels. And then under Islam, it was demons, angels, and jinn are a specific being unto themselves because they're a creation of light or fire or wind, and they kind of can be formless. They can take a form. They're kind of their own little myth, right? By having the ability to, for lack of a better thing, have a supernatural construction aspect to it, you want to have 100,000-ton block of stone that you want to move around and stack them together, call in the big guy. Get two of them to lift if it's really big. Put it in place, right? It ties back to that little piece in our Masonic ritual about, no sound of a, stone being altered to do it and how everything fit together perfectly. And it's just kind of like, okay, so maybe there's a little bit of supernatural help in it, kind of look at some of those structures and go, we've seen some pretty amazing things around the world that we're still trying to figure out how they did it. I'm not going to say ancient aliens, but
showing up, like a keystone showing up that we throw away.
Yep.
Things like that.
I mean, I guess from my side, and then this is 100% my personal thing, the more that we explore, the more that we open what could or couldn't be. Right. So whether or not a person is going to sit there and say, fantastic fairy tale, thanks for sharing it, or whether or not somebody goes, okay, that's kind of an interesting concept. That's really the entire point of this, right? So if we sit there and as a Mason, we keep in mind approaching anything with an open mind in the point of gaining our understanding and increasing our own personal knowledge, then to go, okay, you know what? Our ritual talks about it being assembled within, a perfect balance and being this grand edifice. And Here's a part that explains it. Is it possible? Maybe. Right? And that's just really what it's about, is always looking at what the maybe just might be.
Very good. Oh, Brent, thank you again. That was a fascinating presentation. I always enjoy discussing this topic with you, and so I hope everyone else enjoyed it as much as I did. And next week we have Brother Adam Goldman presenting to us, and he's going to do a follow-up to Brother Joe Martinez's presentation from last week on the Osirian mythos. And Adam is going to really knock it out of the ballpark. He's going to pick up with where Joe left off, essentially build on that, and it's going to be fantastic. So I should have the announcement up no later than tomorrow. So be sure to register for that. It's going to be a great event. And with that, I just want to wish everybody a good night. And again, thank you for joining us tonight. I know you could have been doing a lot of other things, but you chose to be here. We really appreciate that.
And thank you once again for letting me present.
Absolutely. And hope to have you back again.
It'd be my pleasure.